Hello again. In this lesson, we're going to finish building the rest of the page and take the opportunity to practice what we've learned so far. This one's going to be a bit longer than usual, but it'll be worth it as a one-off, just to get deeper into the fine details. Let's get to work on the testimonial section. You might recognize one or two of these people, especially if one of them is you. If so, hi Kevin, hi there Kyle, hi Steve. You're famous. Sort of, anyway. All right, you see that there's a background color. On each column, there's some internal padding and a nice rounded corner border radius on each one. Inside each column, we have an image, two text elements, one for the quote, one for the name, and the images are circles, even though the original images are square. And also see that all the content is nicely centered inside each column. All right, to the editor. We already have a 3-column grid inside this container, which, as a reminder, is actually container number 2, nested inside the same section as the cards above. As I said before, I could have created a separate section for these testimonials instead, and if later we decide that that'll be better, well, it'd be very easy to do. All right, let's get some content into these columns. Now, again, for speed, I'm going to fast forward past me adding elements to the canvas because you've seen it 100 times now. So that's the basic content in. Clearly, we have lots to do here. First job, let's add that background color to the section. That is really easy. I'll select the section. It already has a class that we created earlier, DF Home Content, so we can just style that class. So I'm going to go into background, and I'm going to add a color from my primary palette. Here it is. And I think I'm going to go with primary dark here. I think the main primary color might be a bit too garish. Yep, it definitely is. So now we can see here pretty clearly that the cards aren't actually the same length. We will fix that later, just hold that thought for now. Let's focus on these testimonials. We need to make the text white, obviously, so that we can actually see it. Where to set white text? Well, I could set that on the parent container for these testimonials, and then that white text style will trickle down to affect all the blocks and the elements inside it. That would be totally fine. It's what we've done before in situations like this, but I'm thinking that these blocks, they're going to need the same class anyway for us to style them all the same, the same background color, the same centered text, etc. I mean, it's a judgment call, right? There's no right or wrong way here, but I reckon in this case, it would be better to just set all the styles for each testimonial on a class. That way we know where all the testimonial styling is in future, and we can change all the styling in one place on the class. Okay, let's find the first block here. I'm going to give this block a custom class and set all the styles on it. Let's call this DF Home Testimonial. Simple and logical, a bit like me, except without the logical bit. While we're on the subject, I am going to be making some more specific training soon about naming classes. I personally have used a naming system called BEM for years. BEM. It stands for Block Element Modifier. It's just a nice convention to use that makes it really easy to understand what job your classes are doing and where they are on the page. But I don't want to go down a class naming rabbit hole here, so let's just keep this simple. So I'm going to apply that same class to the other 2 blocks as well. I'm just going to select each block, and then you can just start typing the class name, tab down to it, and hit return. And I'll do the same for the other block as well. Select the block, and I can just start typing the class name, tab down to it, and hit return. While we're here naming things, I personally like to name the elements in the structure as well. So I'm going to name all of these blocks Home Testimonial. It's just for our reference, but it does make it much easier to come back later and see exactly what's going on. While I'm at it, let's rename the first section in the structure as well. That can be Home Hero. And the second section here can be Home Content. Remember, that's the class that we gave this section, DF Home Content. And while we're at it, let's label these containers as well. Let's go Home Content Cards and Home Content Testimonials. That just tells us that the cards and the testimonials are both inside the Home Content section. Okay, enough with the naming, we better crack on with this. So I'm going to select the first Home Testimonial block and just make sure that the class is active before I start setting styles. Come down into typography and into color, and the white color is inside the ACSS Global palette. And of course, that affects all the other blocks because they all have the same class. All too easy. Next, padding. Okay, so I could come into layout and manually set my own padding in rem here, but I'd have to then set different padding for each breakpoint as well. And I do want to stick to the nice mathematical ACSS spacing scale. And we're going to be able to do that here with variables in the next lesson. But because we're focusing on classes right now, let's just use a class for this instead. So I'm going to use a padding class of pad-m or L. No, let's go with M. Now, of course, this is a separate class, so I'm going to have to add this same class to the other two blocks as well. Again, you might start to see here that this isn't super efficient. We are going to improve this workflow next, but for now, adding a class to each block is totally fine. All right, now we need a background color on these blocks because all this padding looks a bit weird. So we could add a background color class to each block. Let's try that. BG-. Remember, the section background is primary dark, so I want this to be a shade or transparency of primary. I do like these transparent variations here. Let's try 20%. Yeah, that's nice. Okay, well, now I could add the same class again to the next block and again to the next block, but hopefully you're starting to see that this becomes a bit of a pain. I mean, not only does it mean adding multiple classes to each block now, but if I later decide I want these to be 10% transparent instead, well, I'm going to have to replace all three classes. And if we had this testimonial style on several pages, well, nightmare. So let's be more efficient where we can. We already have a custom class here. Yep, DF Home Testimonial. So let's just set the background color on that class instead, and that'll affect all three columns at once. You know, it's not that background classes are wrong, I just want to help you be more efficient. So with the class still selected, into background, and into the color and the ACSS primary palette. And it was this one, primary trans 20. Oh, how about primary trans 10? Maybe a bit too subtle. I'm going to leave it at 20 for now. But you can see how easy it is here to change this style across all three blocks. Okay, next, let's center all the content. Okay, you can see here in the cheat sheet, ACSS does have a set of classes for flex alignment, but really, these classes aren't taking advantage of any of ACSS's automated, fluid, responsive scaling. They're just set in flex align properties, and we already have a class that we can just set those on ourselves. So let's just do that. So with the class selected, I'm going to come down into the flex settings. The main flex direction is set to vertical by default, even though it's not actually selected. But we want the centering to be the opposite of vertical, horizontal. So that is the opposite axis, or the cross axis. That's this one. Not much has happened here. Well, that is partly because we also need to set text align center as well, remember? Let's do that. And the reason that the images haven't changed is because they're already filling all the available space. So you can't tell if they're centered or not. So we do need to make all these images a bit smaller. I want to set the same size on all three images, of course, so let's just create a class for those as well. And for the class, let's go with a simple logical name. You know, if each of these column blocks are DF Home Testimonial, then these can be DF Home Testimonial Image. That way, it's really clear at a glance where these classes are on the page and what job they're doing. And I'll add that same class to the other images as well. Okay, now in layout, I'm going to set a manual width here for this class. There's no need to use ACSS widths for images. Width classes are designed for bigger layout elements, you know, like columns and containers. So I'll just start with 10 rem, and then I'll hold shift down, use my up arrow key to go up in 0.5s. 13 rem? Yeah, I reckon these guys look good at that. Now to make them into circles. ACSS does have a rounded class. That's rounded circle. Although the cheat sheet does say that that's going to be deprecated soon, which just means it's going to be removed. And actually, rounded 50 is the same. It adds a border radius of 50% for the exact same effect. Again, though, we already have a class that we're styling here, the DF Home Testimonial Image class. And border radius really isn't part of ACSS's clever size and spacing system. So let's just come down to border, link the values together, and set them to be 50%. I'm going to pop a solid white border around these images as well. So I'll first link the values together. First it's just opposite sides linked, and then it's all sides linked. Let's try 0.5 rem to start with. Style is solid. and the color can be white. That's down in global. .5 rem is probably a touch too wide. Let's go 0.25 rem. All right, that's great. Next, all these elements are too crushed up together. We need to create some content space with content gap. And as you know already, we have a class for content gap, so let's use that again here. So I'll make sure that I've selected the parent block because I want the content gap to affect all the child elements inside it. Come up to the classes field, start typing content, tab down to it, there it is. I'll do the same on the next block. And the next one. Perfect. That's much better. What about the size of this text? As it stands, this is just our standard body copy text size, or medium in ACSS terms. I wonder if medium is a bit too big inside these testimonials. Let's just add a class to make it smaller. So I'll select the first block again. You might remember from last lesson, those text size classes are text, -- and then S for small. And oh, wow, that is tiny. What's going on? Surely that's not the next step down from medium. Well, actually, and I admit, this took me a few minutes to figure out when I was preparing to make this lesson. Here's what's going on. If we come into ACSS typography settings again, see down in text size overrides? By default, small and extra small have some overrides in place. I've no idea why. Seems a strange decision for a default, doesn't it? Anyway, let's just remove those. And save. Back to the page and refresh. And phew, that's a bit better, isn't it? And actually, if you did want text small to be a little bit bigger than this or smaller than this, then you now know where to override that with your own preference. Anyway, I'm going to add that same class to each column. Again, you can just start typing, hit the tab key, hit enter. Do that for the third column as well. You get the gist of it by now. And finally, for this testimonial section, let's make each person's name uppercase and bold. Now, uppercase and bold aren't really an ACSS thing, so we're just going to add those manually. Now you'll see that we haven't given these names a class yet for us to style, so let's do that now. I'm going to go with DF Home Testimonial Name. I'm going to apply that same class to the other two names now. I'm just tabbing down the list and hitting return. And let's do the third one. And with the class selected, let's set those styles. So I'm going to come into typography, set text transform to uppercase, and font weight can be 600. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, we're almost there, but I do notice here that these two cards are not the same length. That's just because there's more content in this one. And also the testimonials, they're not the same length either because this one has a bit more content. Steve had a bit more to say, so we definitely want to fix that. Let's start with the cards. So we basically want to align these two cards the same height. And we can do that with either flex or grid alignment, depending on what is set on their parent container. So I'll select their parent container. I'm going to be styling it, so I'll need to give it a class name. Remember, it's inside a section called DF Home Content. So I'm going to give this container a class of DF Home Content Container. And with that class selected, come into content. This container, of course, has display grid set on it. So we want to align the child items inside the grid. And the one we want is stretch. And there you go. Now they're the same height. I'll just remove that again just so you can see it. So that's the natural height, and this is the stretched height. Let's do the same with the testimonials. So I'll select their container. We don't have a class on this container to style either, so let's add one now. Remember, each block was DF Home Testimonial, testimonial singular. So on the container, let's go with DF Home Testimonials container. And then do the same stretch to align those grid items as well. Cool. Quick preview. And yep, that's looking pretty good. Okay, next we need to pull these cards up into the first section. You've probably done this kind of thing before, but if not, we just need to add a negative margin. The best way to think of this is if a positive number margin pushes things away, well, a negative margin does the opposite. It pulls things towards. So let's put that in place. So I'm going to select our container again, the container that contains the two card blocks. Just make sure that we're editing the active class. Then into layout. So I'm going to start adding a negative rem margin. I usually start by typing 0 rem, then hold shift down and then hit the down arrow key and, well, let's just see where we end up. I want this to be pulled up so we at least have some of the headings within the section above. Something like that. Minus 25 rem. Yeah, that's good. Now, of course, this container is overlapping the content in the section above. So we need to give the section above more bottom padding to compensate. So I'll select that section. And here we need to add some bottom padding. I'm just going to go with 25 rem. That's just the same amount of positive space back again. And yeah, that's nice. Quickly check that in responsive. Okay, into tablet. That looks fine. Of course, it's dropped down to one column on tablet, then to landscape. Okay, and portrait. No, actually, they're not all that bad. We can come back to tweak responsive later on if we need to. Back to desktop. Okay, while we're here, let's just quickly make all this hero header content centered vertically as well. I've been talking about doing this for a while. Now is the time. So I'm going to select the entire container that's going to affect both columns. I want them both centered vertically. We don't actually have a class to style this container yet, but remember, it's the container that's inside df home hero. df home hero container. And how about I rename that in the structure as well? This can be home hero container. All right, now with that class set, let's come into the content tab. We have grid set on this container, not flex, but that's okay because as you know by now, grid also has its own alignment properties, just like flex does. And this is the one that we want here, align items center. Align items means the items in the grid, which means the child elements, which is the columns in this case. Okay, now we're talking. This looks good. Let's just have a quick look down the page. Yeah, all looking nice. All right, quick preview. Looking good on desktop. Flick to tablet. Mobile landscape. Now, I think on mobile landscape, I'd like these testimonials to drop to one column. They're a bit crushed up here. So back to the editor. I'll select the testimonial container. So you can see here that we set the grid 3 class, and all that's doing is just trickling down to all of the breakpoints. So we just need to add a grid breakpoint class as well. That's grid --. Remember, mobile landscape is the medium breakpoint, and we want one column. Yeah, and I think that's better. Back into preview. And then portrait. Pretty nice. And you can see here how all the paddings and the sizes have all shrunk down accordingly. We've had to hardly do anything. Oh, one thing that these testimonials are missing is a nice rounded corner. So let's come out of preview again. I'll select one of them. Actually, let's make sure that I'm in desktop mode here. Otherwise, the rounded corner would only affect mobile portrait. Select the DF Home Testimonial class again, into Style. And you know where the rounded corners are, they're in border. Link all sides together, and we'll go 1 rem for these as well. One thing I did notice, just come back into preview, back to mobile portrait. For me, Brooding Bruce here is just taking up way too much space. He's way too big. I mean, there's only so much Brooding Bruce anyone can take, right? So let's shrink him down at mobile portrait size. So I'll come out of preview again, make sure he's selected. We're going to have to give him a class. He can be DF Home Hero Image. We're already in the mobile portrait breakpoint here, so all I need to do is come to layout, into width, and let's try a width. Let's say 10 rem. Needs to be a bit bigger than that. I'm going to hold shift key down and use my up arrow. And you know, maybe about 20 rem is good. You know, looking at this now, I feel like I would actually like a bit more generous top and bottom padding on sections. I mean, what we have here is fine, but I just think on reflection, I'd like a little bit more. How do we do that? Well, it's very easy, actually. Let's just save where we are. Come back to ACSS settings and into spacing. Now, I'm happy with the base spacing. I'm happy with the scales. They're all fine. But all it takes is just bumping up this base multiplier to 3 instead. So that'll now multiply the base spacing above by 3 instead of 2. Let's check that out. So I'm going to save changes. Back to the page. Give it a refresh. And yeah, I like that better now. It's so easy though, isn't it? We didn't have to recalculate section padding for each breakpoint or anything like that. It just handles it all automatically. Okay, that's it for classes. As I say, this wasn't meant to be a comprehensive rundown of absolutely every single ACSS class because there's loads of them. But I just wanted to cover the 10% of the classes that I find myself using 90% of the time because they're so useful. All right, you might have heard me mention possibly a couple of times ACSS has a feature called variables. Well, variables are awesome, and you're going to learn how to use them in the next lesson to really streamline your workflow. I'll see you there soon.